The Nile River is the longest river in the world. It cuts through the African desert like a great road made of water. For thousands of years, people built their lives beside this river. They grew food on its banks. They fished in its waters. They used it to carry goods across long distances. Two great civilizations grew alongside the Nile. One was Egypt in the north. The other was Kush in the south. These two kingdoms shared the same river for thousands of years, and for much of that time, they also fought over it. The land of Kush sat in what is today the country of Sudan. In many places it was a dry and hard land. The sun was fierce, the desert was wide, but the land was also full of riches. There was gold in the mountains, there was iron deep in the ground, there were cattle grazing on the open plains, and most importantly, there were people. Strong, resourceful people who had lived along the Upper Nile for thousands of years. These were the ancestors of the Kushites. These were the people who would one day build the kingdom of Meroe. The earliest signs of Kushite power come from a city called Kerma. Kerma sat near what is called the third cataract of the Nile. A cataract is a stretch of the river where the water gets rough, rocky, and wild. The cataracts of the Nile were like natural walls between different parts of the river. They made it very hard for armies to march from one land to the next. For a long time, these rocky stretches kept Egypt in the north and Kush in the south. Each kingdom grew strong on its own side of these natural barriers. The people of Kerma were skilled and creative builders. They raised tall mud brick buildings that stood strong in the desert heat. They made pottery so thin and fine that it looked almost like glass. They buried their kings under giant mounds of earth called tumuli. These burial mounds were enormous. They were filled with treasures, weapons, and the objects of royal life. They told anyone who saw them that the kings of Kerma were wealthy, powerful, and deeply respected. These were not small or simple people. This was a civilization that knew its own worth. Egypt watched the south with careful and calculating eyes. Egyptian pharaohs knew there was gold in Kush. They sent trade missions down the Nile to get it. They sent soldiers to control the roads and river routes. They built stone forts near the cataracts. Egypt wanted the gold, the ivory, and the rare goods that came from Kushite lands. Egypt wanted to control what happened south of its borders. But the kingdom of Kerma had very different ideas about that. The relationship between Egypt and Kush was not simple or clean. Sometimes there was peace and trade between them. Sometimes there was open war. During a period called the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, which lasted from roughly 2055 BCE to about 1650 BCE, Egypt pushed hard into Kushite territory. Egyptian pharaohs built a long chain of forts along the Second Cataract. These were strong, well-built structures. They were meant to control movement, block raids, and keep Kushite power contained. Egypt called the southern lands by names like Wawat and Kush. Egypt treated them as lands to be used and emptied, not respected. But then something important happened that changed everything. Egypt grew weak. A group of foreign rulers from Western Asia, called the Hyksos, invaded northern Egypt. They came with weapons and horse-drawn chariots that Egypt had never faced before. Egypt was shaken and divided from within. The Egyptian grip on the south began to loosen. Trade routes became harder to guard. Soldiers were called back north, and in that moment of Egyptian weakness, the kingdom of Kerma began to grow. The kings of Kerma pushed north. They took back the forts Egypt had built along the Nile. They established trade and contact with the Hyksos rulers in the north. For a remarkable and powerful time, the kingdom of Kush became the strongest African civilization south of the Egyptian delta. The people of Kerma ruled a wide and wealthy stretch of the Nile Valley. They controlled trade. They commanded armies. They were not minor people at the edge of history. They were a force that even Egypt had to take seriously. But Egypt did not stay weak forever. The great warrior kings of the New Kingdom came south with large and powerful armies. Pharaohs like Thutmose I and Thutmose III marched into Kushite lands with chariots and archers. They came with a clear plan and a ruthless purpose. The wars that followed were hard and devastating. Village after village fell. The Nile Valley rang with the noise of battle. Egypt pushed deeper and deeper south. The city of Kerma was eventually destroyed. Egypt crushed the first great chapter of Kushite power with iron force and no mercy. But a kingdom that has survived for centuries does not die in a single battle. The people of Kush survived. Their culture survived. Their fire survived. Far to the south, beyond the reach of Egyptian soldiers, something new was quietly forming. A new center of power would rise. A new dynasty would take shape. And the ancient struggle between Egypt and the south was far from over. Kush was down, but Kush was not finished. After Egypt destroyed the city of Kerma, a long and difficult period began for the people of the south. Egypt was now in full control. Egyptian soldiers stood guard along the Nile. Egyptian officials collected taxes from Kushite towns and villages. Egyptian temples were built on Kushite soil, and Egyptian culture was pressed down hard on people who had their own deep and rich traditions. It was an occupation, and it would last for centuries. But Egypt did not simply hold Kush down the way a boot holds a rock. Egypt had a more complicated plan. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom wanted Kush to become like Egypt over time. They wanted the people of the south to speak Egyptian, pray to Egyptian gods, and live by Egyptian rules. To make this happen, they took the sons of Kushite chiefs and brought them to Egypt. These young boys were raised inside the Egyptian royal court. They learned the Egyptian language. They wore Egyptian clothes. They were given Egyptian names. When they were old enough, they were sent back home to lead their people. Egypt believed that if the leaders of Kush thought like Egyptians, then Kush would always stay loyal and obedient. It was a form of control that did not always need swords. This plan worked for a time. For about 400 years, from roughly 1550 BCE to 1070 BCE, Egypt held the land of Kush under its authority. The Egyptians called their governor in the south the Viceroy of Kush. This viceroy was in charge of all the southern lands. He made sure gold kept moving north to Egypt. He made sure order was maintained. He kept the local leaders obedient. Egypt used Kush the way powerful nations have always used weaker ones. It drained the land of its wealth and called it order. But during this long period of control, something very important was happening beneath the surface. The people of Kush were absorbing Egyptian culture, yes. They built temples that looked like Egyptian temples. They worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own. They used Egyptian writing and artistic styles in their monuments and carvings. But the Kushites did not simply melt into Egypt. They took what Egypt gave them and shaped it into something of their own. Underneath the Egyptian surface, old Kushite traditions survived. Their own gods stayed alive in quiet places. Their own ways of seeing the world held on through generations. Kush was bending under the weight of Egyptian power, but it was not breaking. The city of Napata became the new center of Kushite religious life during this period. Napata sat near the fourth cataract of the Nile, far deep in Kushite territory. The Egyptians had built a great temple there to the god Amun. Over time, this temple became the most important religious site in all of the south. The priests of Amun at Napata grew very powerful. They controlled spiritual life in the region. They spoke for the gods. And because religion and politics were tightly connected in the ancient world, the priests of Napata began to shape who ruled and how decisions were made. As Egypt began to weaken at the end of the New Kingdom, the power of those priests grew even stronger. The New Kingdom collapsed around 1070 BCE. Egypt broke into competing pieces. In the north, pharaohs struggled against foreign pressure and internal fighting. The empire that had once stretched from Western Asia to Central Africa was now divided, confused, and shrinking. Egyptian control over the south weakened. The viceroy of Kush had no real power anymore. Egyptian soldiers went home, and the people of Kush were left to define themselves again on their own terms. This was a critical moment. Kush had spent 400 years under Egyptian authority, but the spirit of the south had never completely died out. Local leaders began to step forward. The priests of Amun at Napata helped guide the process. A new line of Kushite kings began to form. These kings built their power slowly and with great care. They kept many Egyptian traditions because those traditions had become part of who they were. But they also remembered what came before. They were the heirs of Kerma. They were the children of the Upper Nile. They were Kushite first, and they never forgot it. The new kings at Napata were deeply serious about their purpose. They did not see themselves as rebels against Egypt. They saw themselves as something more important than that. They believed Egypt in the north had become corrupt and godless. The northern pharaohs had allowed foreign powers to take root. Egyptian religious traditions had been allowed to fade. The kings of Napata believed it was their duty, not just their desire, to go north and restore what had been lost. They believed the god Amun himself had called them to this work. This belief was not a simple excuse for going to war. It was the foundation of a massive military and political campaign that would soon shock the entire ancient world. The kings of Kush were preparing to do something no southern kingdom had ever done. They were preparing to conquer Egypt, conquer it completely, and rule it as pharaohs. But before that march could begin, they needed the right king. They needed someone brave enough to lead an army for hundreds of miles through desert and river. They needed someone wise enough to hold two great civilizations together under one crown. They needed someone with fire in his chest and the patience of stone in his hands. That king was being born. His name would soon fill the temples of Egypt with awe and fear, and the world would never see the Nile the same way again. The age of the Black Pharaohs was about to begin. The moment had been building for generations. Kush had survived 400 years of Egyptian control. It had absorbed Egyptian culture while keeping its own spirit alive underground. It had watched Egypt collapse into chaos and division. Now, in the hot, dry land near the Nile's fourth cataract, the kings of Napata were preparing to do what no one in the south had ever done before. The first great Kushite king of this new rising era was named Kashta. His name in the ancient language simply meant the Kushite. Even his name told you who he was and where his pride came from. Kashta was the king who began the slow, careful push toward the north. He did not charge into Egypt with his army at full speed. He was patient, he was smart, he used religion as much as he used soldiers. He used the power of the god Amun and the deep respect of the priests to quietly extend his reach into Upper Egypt, which is the southern part of Egypt that sits closest to Kushite land. By the time Kashta died, his kingdom stretched further north than any Kushite king had reached in centuries. He had not yet conquered Egypt, but he had opened the door. It was Kashta's son who would walk through that door and never look back. His name was Piye. Some history books call him Pianki. Piye would become one of the most remarkable kings in all of ancient African history. He was a trained warrior. He was a deeply religious man. He was a ruler of absolute conviction. And he believed with complete certainty that what he was about to do was not simply conquest for power or wealth. He believed he was carrying out the direct will of the god Amun. In his mind, and in the minds of those who followed him, this march north was a holy mission. Egypt in Piye's time was a broken and divided land. It had not been united under a single strong ruler for a very long time. The north was controlled by a group of local kings and princes who fought each other constantly for pieces of the old empire. The most powerful of these northern rulers was a man named Tefnacht. Tefnacht was ambitious and dangerous. He was pushing south, trying to pull Egypt back together under his own rule. When news of Tefnacht's growing power reached Napata, Pa saw it as both a threat and an open invitation to act. Pa gathered his army. The Kushite soldiers began their long march north along the Nile. These were hardened fighters. They had been shaped by years of desert life and military training. They carried bows, long spears, and swords. They moved with confidence and focus. City after city in Upper Egypt fell before them. Local princes and rulers either surrendered or were defeated in the field. Pa did not massacre the people he overcame. He was not a king who took pleasure in blood. He wanted obedience, order, and the return of proper worship to the god Amun. His war had a purpose beyond battle. There was one city above all others that Pa wanted. That city was Memphis. Memphis was the ancient capital of Egypt. It was one of the greatest cities in the entire ancient world. It sat at the wide point where the Nile splits apart into the many branches of the delta. It was a city of enormous walls, massive temples, and thousands of years of history. Tefnacht had stuffed it with soldiers. He had filled its storehouses with food and weapons. He believed the city could hold. He believed Pa could not take it quickly or easily. Pa saw Memphis differently. He looked at the city and saw a sacred place that had turned its back on the god Amun. He saw a city that did not need simply to be captured. It needed to be reclaimed and made holy again. His attack on Memphis was fierce, focused, and relentless. Kushite soldiers came from the river. They came from the land. They broke through the walls and fought street by street. Memphis fell. Pa walked into the great temples of Memphis himself and performed the religious rituals with his own hands. He was not simply a conqueror standing in a taken city. He was a priest-king, restoring a sacred place to its rightful order. One by one, the remaining cities of Egypt opened their gates or were taken by force. The local princes who had held power came before Pa and bowed their heads to the ground. Even Tefnacht, the most powerful man in northern Egypt, eventually sent a message of submission. He did not come in person. He was too proud, or perhaps too afraid, to stand before Pa face to face. He submitted from a distance. Pa accepted it. In victory, he was measured and restrained. He allowed local rulers to keep their positions as long as they respected his authority and supported the worship of Amun. When Pa finally returned south to Napata, he left something behind that the ancient world had not expected. A Kushite king now sat at the top of Egypt. A man from the south, from the land they had once colonized and drained, now ruled as pharaoh. He had not destroyed Egypt. In his own view, he had saved it. He had brought it back from the edge of godlessness and division. Pa had a great stone monument carved to tell the story of his campaign in detail. This stone was found by historians thousands of years later. It stands today as one of the most powerful documents from the ancient world. It shows a man deeply proud, not just of his military success, but of his faith, his discipline, and his purpose. The story of Pa's conquest was not just a story of war. It was a story of a people claiming their place in history with both a sword and a belief in something larger than themselves. The Black Pharaohs had arrived, and now their work had to continue. Pa returned to Napata as the man who had conquered Egypt. But the kingdom he left behind in the north was not yet fully steady. Egypt had been divided for a long time. The local princes who had surrendered to Pa still held real power in their own areas. The land was calm for now, but that kind of calm does not last by itself. It needs to be held in place. When Pa died, his brother Shabaka took the throne. Shabaka was a firm and decisive ruler. He understood that Pa had won the military battle but had not yet finished the political work. Tefnacht, the stubborn northern leader who had submitted to Pa only from a safe distance, had passed his power to his own son, a man called Bacon Ranef. Bacon Ranef still held authority in the north. He was a living challenge to full Kushite control. Shabaka marched north with purpose and speed. He defeated Bacon-Runef. Ancient records say Bacon-Runef was executed. With that, Egypt came under complete and firm Kushite rule. There was no longer any rival on the throne. The south had the north, fully and finally. Shabaka moved to Memphis and ruled Egypt as pharaoh in the fullest sense of the word. He did not just collect tribute and go home. He governed the land. He built temples. He repaired old religious monuments that had been neglected. He worked hard to find and preserve ancient Egyptian texts and traditions that were slowly being lost. The Kushite pharaohs were not foreign rulers who looked down on Egypt with contempt. They were devoted and serious students of Egyptian culture who believed they understood its true meaning better than many Egyptians did. They ruled with a sense of duty that was unusual even among great kings. The period known as the 25th dynasty, as historians have named it, was a time of significant rebuilding. The Kushite pharaohs restored old temples across Egypt. They built new ones. They brought back religious practices that had gone quiet during Egypt's long years of chaos and division. They reunited the Nile Valley under one strong, focused authority. For ordinary people living in Egypt at that time, the Kushite rule was not experienced as a foreign conquest. For many, it felt like the end of a long period of confusion and the return of real order. After Shabaka came his nephew, Shabitku, and after Shabitku came the most famous of all the Black Pharaohs. His name was Taharka. Taharka ruled over the combined kingdom of Egypt and Kush from roughly 690 BCE to 664 BCE. He is one of the best-known figures in all of ancient African history. His name even appears in the Bible, where he is called by the name Tirhakah. He ruled over a vast stretch of the ancient world, from the deep highlands of Central Africa in the south, all the way to the edges of Western Asia in the north. His power was enormous, his reach was vast, and his energy for building, ruling, and defending his empire matched the size of what he had inherited. Taharka was one of the great builders of the ancient world. He built and restored temples from the southern Nile all the way to the Mediterranean. He raised tall columns and wide gateways. He covered temple walls with detailed carvings and sacred texts. He wanted his time on the throne to be remembered as a golden age for both Egypt and Kush equally, and for a time it was exactly that. Under Taharka, the Nile Valley was stable and productive. Trade moved freely. Harvests were strong. The empire felt powerful and whole. But trouble was coming from the east. A new empire had risen in the land called Assyria, in what is today northern Iraq. The Assyrians were one of the most feared and brutal military forces the ancient world had ever produced. They fought with iron weapons at a time when many other armies still relied on bronze. They were organized, disciplined, and relentless. They burned cities, they deported entire populations to distant lands, and they wanted control over the trade routes and territories of the eastern Mediterranean world, which meant they wanted Egypt. The collision between Taharka and the Assyrian Empire was one of the great military conflicts of the ancient world. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt not once but twice. The first invasion was pushed back hard. Taharka's forces fought with skill and determination. The Assyrians retreated. It was a significant moment. The Black Pharaoh had faced one of the most feared war machines in the world and turned it away. But Esarhaddon was not done. He came back a second time with a larger and better supplied force. This time he drove Taharka out of Memphis. The city fell. Taharka was pushed south along the Nile. Taharka refused to accept defeat quietly. He reorganized, gathered strength, and fought back. He recaptured Memphis after the Assyrians temporarily pulled their forces back. But Esarhaddon's successor, a king named Ashurbanipal, came south again with an even more powerful army. This time, the push was too great. Taharka was driven out of Egypt completely. He retreated all the way back to Napata, the original Kushite homeland. He died there around 664 BCE. He had ruled the greatest empire of the ancient world. He had built monuments across thousands of miles of river and desert. But he could not hold Egypt against the iron strength of Assyria. His successor Tantamani made one final attempt to reclaim the north. He marched into Egypt and briefly took Memphis back, but the Assyrian response was crushing. Their army sacked the great city of Thebes, one of the most sacred religious centers in all of Egypt. The destruction of Thebes sent a shock across the ancient world that even the Greeks writing from far away recorded with horror. The 25th dynasty was finished. The Kushite pharaohs had ruled Egypt for about 80 years. They had built, restored, governed, and fought. They had proven without question that the people of the African South were capable of leading the most advanced civilization in the known world. But now they were heading home. Far to the south, along the Upper Nile, the kingdom of Kush was still alive, and its most independent and original chapter was just beginning. When the Kushite kings left Egypt behind, they did not leave empty-handed. They carried something that no Assyrian army could take away from them. They carried centuries of knowledge, experience, and cultural depth. They had governed the world's most famous empire. They understood architecture, trade, religion, law, and administration in ways that few kingdoms anywhere on earth could match. They returned to the Upper Nile, not as beaten refugees running from defeat. They returned as a royal line with deep roots and a long memory, ready to build something new. At first, the Kushite kings stayed close to Napata, near the Fourth Cataract. They kept building temples and monuments there. The great temple of Amun, at a sacred mountain called Jebel Barkal, which rose dramatically from the flat desert floor near Napata, remained the most holy place in the kingdom. Kushite kings continued to be crowned there in long and serious ceremonies. They continued to bury their royalty beneath pyramids, a tradition they had taken from Egypt long ago and shaped into something distinctly and powerfully their own. The Kushite pyramids are worth stopping to understand. When most people imagine ancient pyramids, they picture the wide, gently sloped structures of Egypt. The Kushite pyramids were completely different. They were narrow and extremely steep. They shot upward from the desert floor like sharp stone spears aimed at the sky. They were smaller than the Egyptian ones, but there were far more of them. Hundreds of these steep pyramids spread across the desert of what is now Sudan. Many of them still stand there today, in long, silent rows across the sand. They are among the most beautiful and overlooked monuments on Earth, and they represent a civilization full of creative energy, identity, and pride in its own way of doing things. Over time, the center of Kushite power shifted further south to a city called Meroe. Meroe sat between the fifth and sixth cataracts of the Nile, in a region that received more rainfall than the drier areas further north. That difference mattered. More rain meant more grass for cattle. More fertile ground meant more food for a growing population. The land around Meroe also had thick forests of acacia trees that could be cut and burned as fuel for fires. And deep in the earth beneath and around Meroe there was iron ore, large and rich deposits of it. Iron was one of the most important materials in the ancient world. Whoever controlled iron production controlled the sharpness of their tools and the strength of their weapons. Egypt had always needed to import much of its metal from distant places, but Meroe sat directly on top of some of the largest iron ore deposits in the ancient world. The people of Meroe became highly skilled ironworkers over many generations. They built large furnaces and working forges. They produced iron tools, iron weapons, and iron goods that were traded across the ancient world. Meroe became one of the most significant centers of iron production anywhere on the African continent. The massive piles of iron slag left behind by all of that smelting work are so large that some early European historians, upon finding them, called Meroe the Birmingham of Africa. comparing the ancient city to the famous industrial centre of England. Trade made Meroe wealthy. The city sat at the meeting point of trade routes that connected the deep interior of Africa to Egypt in the north, to the Red Sea in the east, and to Arabia and the Mediterranean world beyond. Goods travelled through Meroe in every direction. Gold arrived from the south. Ivory came from the central forests of Africa. Rare animal skins, ebony wood, and other precious goods passed through Meroitic markets. In return, Meroe received glass, cloth, and luxury goods from the world to the north. The city was alive with visitors and merchants from many different lands and cultures. The culture that developed in Meroe during this period was rich, original, and deeply confident. The people of Meroe were no longer simply following Egypt. They had developed their own written language, now called Meroitic script. This writing system was built from symbols based on Egyptian hieroglyphics, but it represented the sounds of the Kushite language, not the Egyptian one. Modern scholars have learned to read the individual sounds of Meroitic script, but the language itself is still not fully understood. Thousands of inscriptions written in Meroitic survive today, carved on temple walls and grave markers across Sudan. And much of what they say remains a locked mystery, one of the most fascinating unsolved puzzles in all of ancient history. Meroitic religion also developed its own direction. One of the most important gods of the Meroitic kingdom was a lion god named Apodimak. He was shown in sacred carvings as a figure with a human body and the head of a fierce lion. His temples were built at sites across the Meroitic kingdom. He represented the raw power, the ferocity, and the military spirit of the Kushite people. While Egyptian gods like Amun remained important and respected, the presence of Apodimak showed that Meroitic religion was growing in its own independent direction, apart from Egypt. The role of women in the Meroitic kingdom stands out sharply in history. Women in Meroe could hold and exercise real political power in ways that were extremely rare in the ancient world. Some women ruled as queens in their own right, not simply as the wives or mothers of kings. These ruling queens were known by the title Kandak. The Kandakis of Meroe were not ceremonial figures. They gave orders, they commanded armies, they made state decisions, they built temples and wrote their names on monuments. The power of women in Kushite leadership was not an accident or an exception. It was a defining characteristic of this civilization. By the time the Roman Empire rose to dominate the Mediterranean world, the kingdom of Meroe had been thriving independently for centuries. It had survived everything: Egyptian conquest, Egyptian occupation, the fall of the 25th dynasty, centuries of political change and outside pressure, and it had come through all of it with its own identity intact. Now, a new challenge was coming. The most powerful military empire the Western world had ever produced was expanding south, and Meroe was directly in its path. Rome was coming, and Meroe was not afraid. When Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, the balance of power in the ancient world shifted in a sudden and permanent way. The great kingdom of the pharaohs fell to the Roman general Octavian, who would become the first Roman emperor under the name Augustus Caesar. Egypt was made a Roman province, and with Egypt came the long southern border that touched the kingdom of Meroe. Rome and Meroe were now neighbors. They were separated by nothing but a stretch of river, desert, and the pride of two very different worlds. Rome looked south along the Nile with the same hungry eyes that Egypt had turned in that direction for thousands of years. Control of the south meant control of trade routes, gold, and strategic power. Augustus sent a governor called a prefect to rule Egypt in his name. The first of these governors, a man named Cornelius Gallus, pushed south along the Nile almost immediately. He captured several Meroitic settlements near the first and second cataracts of the Nile. Rome was testing the border. It was pushing to see how far south it could go before something pushed back. But then, Rome made a costly mistake. Augustus needed soldiers elsewhere. He pulled a large number of troops out of Egypt to support a military campaign in Arabia. The Roman military presence along the southern border became thin. There were fewer soldiers, fewer forts were fully manned. The people of Meroe were watching, and when they saw that the border had grown weak, they did not hesitate. In 25 BCE, the Meroitic army marched north across the border into Roman-controlled territory. At the head of this army was one of the most remarkable leaders in all of ancient African history. Her name was Amanirenas. She was the Candake of Meroe, the warrior queen. Ancient accounts describe her as a woman of immense personal courage and fierce pride. She had lost one of her eyes, either in battle or to illness. She carried that loss without slowing down for a single day. Amanirenas led her soldiers deep into what is today the southern part of Egypt. Her forces swept through the Roman border towns. They captured settlements. They tore down statues of Augustus Caesar, the Roman emperor whose empire had just arrived on Meroe's doorstep. They carried the stone and bronze heads of those statues back south to Meroe as trophies and symbols of what they had done. One of those bronze heads was found by archaeologists in modern times. It is the face of Augustus Caesar himself, carefully buried beneath the steps of a Meroitic temple. It was placed there with deliberate intention, so that every person who walked into that temple would step directly on the face of the Roman emperor. This was not an act of careless looting. It was a message written in stone and bronze and the weight of footsteps. Meroe was not afraid of Rome. Meroe was not going to stand aside. Meroe was stepping on Rome, literally every single day. The Roman response came hard and fast. The new Roman governor of Egypt, a man named Gaius Petronius, assembled a large and well-equipped army and marched south. He drove the Meroitic forces back across the border and kept going. He pushed deep into Kushite territory. He reached and captured Napata, the old sacred capital of the Kushite kingdom. Roman soldiers moved through the city and destroyed parts of it. Petronius took thousands of Meroitic people as prisoners and sent them back to Rome. It was a show of Roman power intended to end the conflict quickly and completely. But Petronius could not stay. The distance from Egypt was simply too great. Keeping a Roman army in the deep south of Kushite territory was expensive and logistically impossible to maintain. Roman supply lines could not stretch that far without breaking. Petronius pulled his army back north, and the moment he did, Amanirenas moved again. She gathered her forces, she pushed north again, she struck the Roman border settlements, she harassed Roman positions along the Nile. She turned the southern frontier into a constant, draining problem for Rome. Amanirenas understood the strategic situation with great clarity. She did not need to destroy the Roman Empire. She did not need to win a single great and final battle. She needed to make the cost of continuing to fight her kingdom higher than any benefit Rome could gain by doing so. She needed to make staying expensive and going home look reasonable. Her understanding was correct. Her strategy worked. Around 21 or 22 BCE, representatives of Rome and representatives of Meroe sat down together and negotiated a formal peace agreement. This agreement is known today as the Peace of Samos, named after the Greek island where the Roman Emperor Augustus was residing at the time the final terms were settled. The terms of that agreement were extraordinary. Rome returned the prisoners that Petronius had taken south to Rome. Rome agreed to recognize a clear boundary and not push south past it into Meroitic territory. Rome also removed certain taxes it had been placing on Meroitic traders. These were not the terms that a defeated people accepts from a victor. These were the terms of two powers sitting across a table as equals, each giving something and each receiving something in return. The Peace of Samos stands as one of the most remarkable moments in the long history of Africa's ancient civilizations. A kingdom from deep in the African continent, a kingdom whose history stretched back to the very origins of civilization along the Nile, had taken on the most powerful military empire the Western world had ever built. And it had not been crushed, it had not been absorbed, it had not disappeared. It had fought, held its ground, pressed back, and walked away from the negotiating table with its dignity, its borders, and its sovereignty still intact. The kingdom of Meroe continued for several more centuries after the wars with Rome ended. Its steep pyramids kept rising from the desert floor, its iron furnaces kept burning, its trade routes stayed open. Its people kept writing in their own script and worshipping their own gods. But eventually, history reached even Meroe. Around 350 CE, a powerful southern kingdom called Aksum, centered in what is today northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, attacked and destroyed the city of Meroe. The long, magnificent chapter of the Kushite kingdoms along the Upper Nile came to a close.